Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, it's my pleasure to welcome Pierre Mitchell, the original procurement analyst and chief research officer and managing director of Spend Matters. On what, crazily as I looked at the calendar, today is the 9th anniversary, if you're listening to this on the day of publication, of the last time that Pierre was on the podcast as we looked at the Procure Tech landscape for 2017. Well, we caught up recently at DPW and SAP Spend Connect and agreed a catch up on the pod was long overdue, looking now at 2025. So in our conversation, we dug into the procurement technology trends of the moment. We separated some hype from reality, and I asked Pierre to do some crystal ball reading to share some of his projections on where we might be 12 months from now. So with all that said, let's jump into the conversation. I started by asking Pierre if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
Well, it actually found me back in the 90s when in one of my tours in management consulting, I did some sourcing work and, so I guess it found me because there was a lot of sourcing projects. So that's really how I cut my teeth. My background is supply chain. Honestly, I always looked at procurement as like, procurement, doing deals and pushing POs, not very exciting, Get me into supply chain network, redesign and optimization, right? As a industrial engineer, much more interesting, cognitively. But as you get into it, right, as you kind of redefine what really procurement is, really all about around designing these extended, networks and, part of the imbalanced supply chain, it actually kind of put its hook in me, right? So I haven't left it since. So it's kind of flipped for me. Obviously now supply chain a little bit more broadly is a little more feeds and speeds, and procurement is the art and science of procurement.
So why or how did you become an analyst? You've been an analyst for a long time now. Probably the most familiar analyst in the procurement space, I would say, and there's not a lot that you haven't seen over the last few years. And so, how and why was that kind of your calling?
Well, yes, I do date back to the Jurassic period. First kind of procurement tech analyst in this space back in the 90s, in the last millennium, and it was in the dot-com days in 99. And definitely seen a lot of stuff. But what's interesting is when you see a lot of the same things, kind of over and over, right, in terms of the cycles, the innovative cycles, money comes pouring in, and then, just as quickly it goes out. I think what's really interesting, just kind of having covered it this long, is when you get these kind of sea changes in technology and then eventually how that actually gets used. So obviously, the move to cloud based architectures and moving away from on-premise, that was a big game changer. But with AI right now, it's a huge deal, right? And it's not just in terms of, hey, Gen AI can help us, in these little use cases, et cetera, et cetera. But, over time, it's really going to be an interesting change around the architectures and the systems themselves when you start to collect from a knowledge management standpoint, right? When you start to collect all the knowledge that, not just the data, but the knowledge that's out there outside in, right? But also inside of people's heads, and having a way to really capture that and use that and build upon it. But what it also means is kind of going beyond traditional kind of relational database, architectures done the same way. There's some interesting trends going on how do I hook up these things around large language models, right? And the agentic workflows and all that kind of stuff. But kind of that Gen AI with your good old fashioned traditional, relational databases. So, deep, kind of data modeling with the language models and language models. And then we have kind of simple domain specific data models within the applications and source to pay apps. So bringing those two things together through knowledge models and knowledge graphs, and we can talk maybe a little more about this later, I think is going to be a real game changer because it also lets practitioners take the high ground in how they actually model and own their own data. But they can only do that when the technology markets can kind of get to the point where they can really use them well. Because right now it's kind of, the land of the gorillas with all the hyperscalers and the big, suite vendors and whatnot, and the ERP guys, as well as, all the little startups. So we could talk more about the tech side, but that's the thing that's most exciting to me is some of the changes that are happening right now with regards to the core tech that will give people a lot better options for those vendors who are able to kind of step up and offer that.
Does that mean then that, we look at the procurement tech market through a lens of a familiar taxonomy of products, here's your spend analytics tool, here is your suite, here is your sourcing platform.
Right.
Do we go away from that and do, thinking about the solution, the challenges that we have, and thinking about addressing them in perhaps different ways than what our traditional thinking has been in terms of what the procure tech market looks like and how it's sorted, fragmented.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you have to go back to the first principles, right? And I think anybody in procurement who wants to learn about tech would, it's good to kind of master things around understanding kind of architectures and data models and how just applications work and how you build apps and, and in the world of, IT and technology and there's kind of two different worlds, right? There's kind of a process view of the technology, which you've talked about, which is fine. Process-centric, source to pay, which is, the chevrons, all that stuff, right? From, spend analytics and sourcing contracts into P2P, which is totally fine. That is kind of an extremely valid and business-centric view. That's where you organize your, your metrics. That's how you, just look at the world, right? So, which is totally fine. The other part of it is data. And I know we always say, oh, data's messy, data quality, but you don't really think more beyond that. And if you're going to think about data, the first thing is to say, how do I actually model the data, right? To model the supply chains and model my costs and contracts and my people, my workflows, right? So everything ultimately gets back to data, right? So it's how you actually can kind of model and manage data in different ways around master data, around analytics, around, et cetera. And that's kind of the piece around like the knowledge graphs, right? How do you kind of, right, model that stuff? So you have to kind of be beyond kind of looking at the process-centric world, you have to then kind of almost take a, what we talk about is kind of a platform-centric model. And what that means is, no matter what apps that you're building, whether it's in source to pay or in enterprise risk or, whatever, at the end of the day, there's going to be data in a data model, and whether that's in little objects or kind of a big, a big monolith, a big, set of suites and integrated data model. There's going to be a data story. There's going to be a process automation story, and that's where orchestration primarily lives, right? Kind of workflow on steroids and integration. There's also going to be an analytics story, and analytics is primarily aligned mostly to data, right? Kind of grabbing all the data up, analyzing it, and then injecting it back down into hopefully the workflows when you can, use it most. And then there's the act of just creating the tooling, the act of creating the apps. This is like manufacturing engineering in manufacturing. You're creating the tools. And this is kind of where the need for resiliency and flexibility is, there's platform. This is the low code, no code, but also just all the way to pro code, right? From getting it from third parties or ones that, you build yourself in IT, let's say, kind of full custom. So these are and then AI energizes all those things, right? It energizes, and the data, the analytics, the orchestration on the workflow, think agents, right? They're on the integration and also around the generation of the apps themselves. So as we start to, and all those things have been kind of like wed together. So when historically, when you buy an app, you're getting all that stuff
right
built together. It's in the castle, it's in the walled garden. Why would you ever leave? Well, it's a multi-vendor world out there, right? So this is kind of now where we shift from apps to the platforms that really build on the apps. So there is a sea change that is coming, but it's harder to think around those things, right? Versus just good old-fashioned process-centric,
right.
Thinking. But it's the data that comes up through those apps and models through those processes and models those processes. That's just as important.
So on the data side, like my mental model has always been, if we can't get the data right, it's very hard to effectively be able to use tools. Getting the data right obviously means a bunch of different things. But on the other hand, I've started to think, do we use that as an objection to not? It's easy to stand behind.
Totally.
We have bad data and we're not going to start.
Right.
And so we kind of sometimes can overplay that. Well, we got bad data, and so we can't do anything.
Totally. That's totally the case. Right? It's kind of like the executive card of like, well, we need the tech to actually help implement this business change, right? And the executive will say, well, why don't you go ahead and do all the process redesign, all that first? Then let's talk about how we can use the technology, and of course, they're trying to, get away from having to spend any money. And it's the same kind of thing here, right? So, it's kind of like, well, we need to have, 4 sigma data, to help us fix a problem where we're only running at 1 sigma. And, you're never going to clean that data up on its own. So you have to bundle it in with process change and, agile and business releases and all that kind of stuff. Because, do you think you're ever going to fund let's clean up the data project, versus everything else? It's never going to happen, right? So you got to clean as you go and certainly identify those root cause data problems of, end users putting in crappy commodity codes during the P2P process. Great. Let's tackle some of the low-hanging fruit there, right? While we actually then attack some things around the vendor master and, things like that and start to build our, our muscles around data governance and data management and modeling, not just the data quality and effect, which is the result of too many systems and training, poor data governance. All those things are all root causes that you have to start to know what you're dealing with and start to address incrementally, because you're never going to solve it all. It's second law of thermodynamics. Everything is going to go to maximum entropy and disorder over time, right? So you got to just kind of pay attention, just deal with it on an ongoing basis.
So we've talked a little bit about AI, and you've seen a lot of, and I'm thinking generative AI specifically. You've seen a lot of trends come and be hyped and kind of disappear into the ether.
Yeah.
Is Gen AI transformational for procurement tech?
I think absolutely. And so I think it's a question of kind of how you frame it, right? So if you kind of look at, this is almost like, you look at like blockchain, right? And it's like, okay, it's great, it's cool, but are transparent distributed transaction registries going to be fundamentally game changing? I mean, yeah, it's great for provenance and supply chain tracking and all that, but is it really, is a better ledger going to actually, be strategic? No, of course not. Now, if you're talking about, okay, well, how do we actually build our corporate brain, our knowledge brain, our procurement brain, our individual and collective knowledge as we have talent problems, as people are retiring? How do we, we got this fragmented portfolio of apps that are copying data all over the place. That's not really a great way to scale. And you're going to hit the wall, and you do hit the wall because you spend all your time, managing this tactical stuff versus actually getting to next level with the data, which is going from data to information to then, knowledge. That's the key piece. And so for example, taking all this data that sits in contract portfolios or sitting in your policy documents or sitting out on the outside, all that market intelligence that you're bringing in, all of that stuff more and more is starting to get coalesced, both from the relational database apps models that are trying to kind of go broader and be able to be more, to kind of have not turn the data into knowledge. And then what you also see on kind of the, let's say on the service, like on the hyperscaler side and all the Gen AI providers, they're taking kind of this mass data. Let's try to make that more usable. It's bringing those things, together. That's powerful. And a lot of the service providers are actually taking the knowledge that's in their heads and building solutions with that collective knowledge from all their consultants. But you can do the same thing with community intelligence, right? From some of the tech providers to kind of, bring that up, capture it, and then use it and systematically use it. So this is around now. This is not like, well, that doesn't sound very fun, kind of the knowledge modeling piece versus kind of the, you know, um, seeing the end effect of what it can do in the different use cases. But it is going to be fundamentally game changing, especially when you start going to things like knowledge graphs and graph databases that basically, I mean, if you look at Google and all the, the big hyperscalers, they run all their B2C systems on graph databases, which are much more flexible and scalable than traditional kind of relational database technology. So, if you've heard about retrieval augmented generation and how do we kind of bring, the power of large language models into the world of enterprise apps, which is great, you're going to hear more and more around GraphRag, which is graph-enabled retrieval augmented generated database. So the whole piece is bringing the world of language models and broad-based, kind of, but low-level, context-free kind of language models with very highly specific tabular data and very narrow within the world of the S2P and just broader enterprise apps within relational databases. Bringing those things together is going to unlock a huge amount of value because obviously the people, procurement organizations that are able to master this knowledge around their workflows and their categories and kind of bring that outside in on demand, bring that intelligence into their processes and into their tech are going to really be able to get that 5x, 10x, 20x kind of performance advantage. So it's a game changer over time. Right now it's easy for folks to be like jaded and be like, oh, this is just another hype thing. And, it can look that way, but there's some stuff that's coming that's going to be fundamentally game changing.
How do you see the Procure tech market as, I don't know if adapted is the right word, embraced generative AI? How are you seeing it in, from a product perspective? Is it still relatively surface level or are you seeing some really interesting kind of game changing applications?
For sure. Yeah. So it's a little bit both because the stuff that's kind of game changing, a lot of the vendors may not necessarily talk too much about it, right? Because, they don't want to give away competitive advantage. But, I would say, we did a whole study last spring around Gen AI and the use cases and the value and all that stuff. And there's kind of the level of sophistication in these use cases, right? So, one is just being able to, obviously summarize data or, take my procurement policy, manual and kind of make it more operationalize that FAQs and whatever, And then the next one was like, okay, how do we then do things like bots or whatever, but like kind of talk to the data, talk to the apps. How do we make it more conversational, easier to use, user friendly, right? Cases here around, whether it's on intake management for the casual requisitioner, whether it's around, kind of FAQs for procurement help desk, right? All that kind of stuff. It's kind of, when I talked about that retrieval augmented generation, that's kind of what we're talking about is taking the data that sits within your S2P tech apps, like kind of making it more easy to talk to and to relate to and to kind of, just much more around usability and adoption and as it gets more sophisticated, then you start getting into, well, how do we start to run deeper and broader analytics that start to use this? And a lot of times what the tech providers are doing is they're just using Gen AI as a better strap for a lot of traditional kind of use cases. So if you just kind of look at spend analytics where you're using traditional auto classification using kind of older AI, when you're seeing these deep patterns in the data, you can actually do that a bit better, right? So it's like it's data hungry, right? But the more data you can pipe into this stuff, the more more value. And then as you start to get more sophisticated, then you start to get into, well, okay, now I really want the kind of augment what I'm doing, like really live operationally. So, okay, not just let's say, all right, counterparty needs in, we need to analyze it. Great. So with, one level of AI, it's let's analyze that data, immediately summarize it, correct what, this contract is all about, extract out the key terms, tell us a little bit about, what's the risks that are in this counterparty contract or where there's, negotiate leverage potential here because it's like an outlier versus other contracts I'm expecting to see in whatever, SaaS contracts. Next level will be like, all right, let's kind of see how well this matches against our playbook if you have them and standard clauses. So now it's just kind of just trying to find similarity, and it's bringing up your best, alternative clauses to recommend. But then it might actually be like, okay, well, now generate the actual language that I want to use. And so get into language generation that's really in context and usable, in terms of generate the language, generate the RFX, generate the SOW, all of those things, but do it kind of, at a level that I would expect for it to be. That's when you actually now start to get that. It's really now augmenting you well. And as it's doing that, it's also learning and kind of building this kind of, robotic version of you by being able to model those things that you would go through, the reasoning that you would go. So we're actually going back to kind of old AI, and all this stuff around agentics is really starting to get into about real AI, around the reasoning that you do around how do I make choices around the best negotiation strategy and, all these types of things, right? So that's kind of where the state of the art is right now, is around kind of the reasoning based, AI and, agentics and all that. And I love tech, and I'm not a skeptic for being a skeptic's sake, but you have to think really hard about whether you want to start building intelligent bots with all of your business rules and start sucking all that stuff out of your existing apps and out of your heads and putting those into like little objects and little agents, because that's not necessarily a future-proofed strategy. Because if that vendor, something happens to them, you need to be able to, you thought it was hard to get, your data and business rules out of a traditional app, right? To think about this new world. So anyway, you asked a simple question. But I think that's an example of how the evolution of Gen AI is going to be changing kind of these example areas. So we can pick different areas if you want to dive into them, but I think that's the general trend.
So there's obviously a lot of change happening in the procurement tech market. I wonder, like, what are the key trends that you're just tracking, as a firm at Spend Matters, but, individually on the impact of changing technology and trends on procurement?
Yeah. Well, the latest trend is geopolitical and chaos and, planning about what to do around that. Unfortunately, in this case, I have not yet seen a single app that does dynamic supply network, kind of planning, costed all the way to the consumer level, doing all these kind of, these pieces. It's a real mashup of different things, but let's get away from kind of the, that does expose kind of where you're lacking a lot of strategic data, though. Let's be clear.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of busy, as we're recording this, a lot of busy teams figuring out supply scenario plans manually, I think.
Yeah, a little late to the game with, scenario plan. It's just like supply chain risk, right? It's like, it's all great until you get punched in the face, right? To quote Mike Tyson. So
yeah,
yeah,
one of those things we've trained on that as well. And, there's never any interest until it's too late.
Right.
And at that point, what can you do about it? Everyone's running around, and then everybody forgets until the next crisis.
Exactly. Yeah, supply chain whack-a-mole. But you're right. Well, that's the other piece around building that knowledge, right? And that knowledge base is being able to do that. Just like in category management, right? So around category strategy tools, right? It's one of the pieces of value of using tools like that is you're codifying the strategy itself using strong analytics, and you're actually kind of putting it into something beyond, a binder or a PowerPoint presentation, et cetera. So anyway, I guess that is one of the trends, right? So I think there is a trend towards starting to get serious about managing our organizational knowledge, given that we have a talent problem, right? Of folks that are either walking out the door or constantly churning, and new folks are coming in trying to, bring new thinking and skills, and things like that. So kind of not trying to get away from the business as usual. You get a lot of the new supply chain MBAs coming in. they have no patience for really old tech built, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and all of the, the nuances there, right? They want to be able to move fast. They want to be able to change the tooling. They're willing to, kind of put in the work here, but they are, they're not kind of accepting the status quo. So there is a trend towards, and that has, that means different things too on the technology side, right? So if you look at I think this was the big year of orchestration. And of course, orchestration means many things to many people, right? It's like anything, right? Just like procurement or sourcing or category management or whatever, right? But orchestration to one extent is, right, how do we just orchestrate our business and our suppliers in our supply chains at the high level to, where it kind of really is right now is around how do we build the workflows and the processes independent of all the stuff that we've bought in the past. So it's like that scene from Apollo 13 where they put all the crap on the table. It's like, you got to take all this and make it do this, without a lot of money, right? So the orchestration kind of area is really around a capability of building kind of next gen workflows. And in some cases, it's not just layering a workflow on top of the existing, kind of crappy apps that you have. A lot of the new, more interesting tech around orchestration is next gen kind of app players that have a data model themselves, but it's a much more flexible data model. So where a vendor master file is actually like a supplier information management best of breed vendor that can really house its own data as well as sit on top of existing data that you have. And that's for every kind of piece of data that's out there. Right? So it's a new generation of apps and app architecture that says, I don't have to kind of store all the data myself or necessarily use all the tech myself. And this is a challenge because when they're in the world of the tech, the hyperscalers and all these big vendors who want everybody to go into their walled gardens, it's a bit more challenging. But this area around orchestration and being able to kind of layer on top of existing apps is a huge trend, and to do so easily because you're never going to run away from the inherent complexity of integration and dealing with those older apps, because that's really where the hard part is actually connecting to those different things. So obviously orchestration is a major issue. Intake is really those sets of use cases, which are great, right? In terms of finally getting to the real guided buying scenario. So, I coined that term, 20 years ago, which was not about, crappy smart forms, dumb forms. It was really about, what does the end user need? And you guide them down the preferred process to the preferred systems in whatever. And now we can actually start to do that with the technology in terms of dynamically creating the workflows, having to, just finally making that happen, right? So intake is a great set of use cases where orchestration gets used a lot, but orchestration capabilities, right? Versus let's not just talk about, this is some totally separate, market. But so when we were talking about digital platforms, right, around these different pieces, orchestration is a set of capabilities, right? So that is you're going to see that around, let's say, a third-party risk management, right? So we take ESG requirements and all the GRC and enterprise risk things, and now we're trying to translate that to the world of category management, supplier management, and into just good old-fashioned sourcing, supplier qualification, certification. How do we take all that outside in data around risks and regs and all that enterprise stuff and get IT and risk management and procurement and contract, legal on the same page to dynamically present only what's required from suppliers within these types of workflows, not just within S2P, right? So this is kind of where the need for orchestration will never go away. It's just going to get more enterprise centric. So this is where you need to get on the same page as IT and procurement. And I think this is a trend of the better procurement organizations, internally procurement working more closely with IT so that we're not banging heads, but getting aligned to be like, all right, IT, you want to kind of do something around the analytics space, right? You have your own preferences around what we want to use around our particular business intelligence vendor or our Gen AI strategy where you're picking a, OpenAI or whoever, you want to use, or an open source, whatever, working closely with them so that you actually, God forbid, work together to serve the stakeholders and what they're trying to do in the business units and and whatever. So that is a trend of actually of the more, advanced organizations working together, IT and procurement, to be a little more agile, all right, and to kind of find these joint areas where they both can, show up. Otherwise, all sorts of bad things happen. You go down a certain path, and suddenly it's like, oh, sorry, forget about all that best of breed stuff. We're just going with the, with the ERP vendor because, well, I won't go down it. But that's just that happens all the time, right? That's happened to me twice with some clients in the last year. So anyway, that's the organizational.
Yeah, I got a couple of follow-up questions just on one. It was interesting what you said about guided buying. I look at the intake and orchestration as finally being able to live up to the promise of guided buying that, I think we've struggled the last year. We've called things guided buying, but they truly haven't been. So it was interesting you just kind of noting that. But I want to ask about orchestration. Well, it's kind of intake and orchestration together. Obviously, it's a space that's exploded in terms of the provider market. But probably some providers calling themselves intake and orchestration because it's a hot market versus having the capabilities, and then some having obviously the capabilities. My question is, what should a procurement leader look for when they're looking to differentiate, a true intake and orchestration platform versus one that kind of says it does, but that's more marketing than product capability?
Yeah, no, sure. Okay, so the first thing is I would think of intake as separate but related with orchestration. So intake is a set of use cases with the front door, right? And how do we engage stakeholder management, demand management in lots of different processes, right? So certainly there's the use case around, casual end user trying to buy something, fine, right? Understand and guide them. But just within sourcing, there's a front door. Oh, we need to add a new vendor. Well, where's that coming from? What do you mean add a new vendor? God, there's a certain little front door there, right?
Yeah.
We need to create a contract. Okay, well, what's the context around creating a new contract? Is it just, changing an SOW, whatever, multi-year SOW? So every little area has kind of front doors, and that's always a great place to start around creating a better user experience and user engagement, and trying to have procurement not actually be that function that is the slow function and the one that just is completely opaque and nobody has an idea how to engage it properly and tries to work around it, right? So, you want to let legal or some other function, right? Be that, right? So, if you're focusing on, that's the what, right? The what and the why. It's kind of around those use cases for intake. Orchestration is just the how, right? And obviously this is in terms of how you do that. And that's just one set of places to do that. And so, for example, you might start with, oh, I'm going to do all the intake and I'm going to get us to the front door and I'll take it from the requisition onwards. In other cases where maybe you don't have the apps behind the scenes, I might want to drive it a little further into those workflows. That's fine. I mean, start, kind of, it's the long-term quick fix, right? Think about the long-term vision, but also think about kind of these initial things where you want to demonstrate so some value. Now, when you talk about the vendors in the space around orchestration and because I think what's nice about what's happened with this market and, with, like Zip kind of really driving the change in the market overall is focusing on that intake problem because it is an issue. And it has actually gotten procurement and IT to work a little more closely together and other functions to kind of say, hey, you know what, let's focus on this. But in terms of the actual capability side, you have to think back to that discussion that we had around kind of platforms. There's a piece around, do I want just kind of workflow automation? I mean, think back to like SharePoint, right? Workflow, right? Or any BPM tool or RPA, right? Or anything where it's like, there's no data model, but it's just kind of the workflow coordination. That's fine, right? You can do a certain amount. But when your apps collectively don't have what you're trying to do, and you'd actually like to maybe go to a next gen application, now you're kind of faced with the conundrum of, do I go through for like the feature 500 list and the new best of breed suite that's out there that could do some amount of orchestration, right? It can kind of have its supplier master be a little separated, kind of almost like a best of breed SIM. It's almost like it's very flexible. Great. Or do I have to go for something kind of that's, a new vendor that's out there that is a little more unproven. We don't know how it's going to shake out. So you have to think about kind of, all right, am I comfortable with just going pure workflow centric, or do I actually want a vendor that has full on data model that's going to be a next gen source to pay suite, And so some of them are very much see the writing on the wall, which is like, hey, we can't just be some workflow vendor that sits on top and maybe we have a couple of master data objects or we store some, some data, but we actually need to go full in, right? That's where you have to just think about your overall strategy around source to pay and where you're going and what's your, real need. And, cause it's just a question of whether you're trying to build to outcomes, whether you're trying to build to capabilities, and how much option value you need in that decision around what that platform will be used for long term. And if you don't know, you probably don't want to be going high end. You want to try to work on those capabilities that you and IT can kind of work on together and make that decision together, especially if you don't only own a lot of the budget for it. That's just a reality, right? So, yeah.
Every year at Spend Matters, you do a Spend Matters 5. You look at 5 companies that have really caught your eye in terms of is something new, or they're approaching a challenge or a problem in a different way. What are you seeing, based on this year's Future 5 that is really interesting in terms of where the market could be going?
Yeah. So I think one of the, since you only get to pick 5, vendors, right? It's never like, it's never that the selection of them is never going to be, indicative totally of the market. I would say that certainly, a lot of the intake and orchestration guys have been kind of featured in the, in the Future 5. There's a lot of kind of mashup stuff that's happening right now, right? In terms of like, CLM plus analytics, right? Or into a lot of these kind of just moving into enterprise spaces, right? In terms of being able to look at risk analytics, and start to do that, not just from, kind of vendor risk, but looking at broader supply chain risk. So actually, I mean, the research that we're doing right now, beyond getting, intake and orchestration fully baked into our solution map benchmark and all that, really getting that hardened. And also baking all the AI, Gen AI requirements, all this, because, we got like 500 requirements. We need to keep everything, current with the market. So that's the welcome to my nightmare, discussion. But no, I think the, for some of these Future 5 guys, it's a lot of moving up to that enterprise level where we're starting to, in essence, kind of do some level of process orchestration. Like I was talking about that TPRM scenario, but starting to bring, like smaller markets together to serve a common problem, because this is what happens, the vendor market and the service market become parallels to what's happening within the silos of the enterprise, right? So you start getting stuff very, focused on, procurement, source to pay or whatever. So, but that area around third-party risk is really a mashup of supplier risk management within SRM. It's IT, risk management. It's enterprise risk. It's GRC that's kind of very regulatory centric, focused. It's tying that into the ESG requirements. It's contract management, right? In terms of, risk, right? And how do you understand and transfer and model risk, right? It's that. So it's all these, and then supply chain risk, and then you got to look at your supply networks, right? So that's an area kind of being able to bring these things together. So it's these kind of mashup areas that are, very, very interesting. And I think one of the, also another, place that's really fascinating is kind of, and I know, the space well, it's kind of taking knowledge around like category knowledge and things that services vendors do, professional services, consulting, MSPs, BPOs, whatever niche category plays, taking their knowledge and putting it into software tools that let them kind of do what they do much better, but also being able to have kind of leave behind tools or really SaaS tools that are also intelligent SaaS tools, right? So, there's just, we can spend a lot of time on this space, but that's a very exciting trend that is going to really disrupt traditional service provider markets, because you can't just be over time, you just can't be a generalist being like, oh, I'm just going to come in and throw some, young consultants at it, and then we'll try to, package slam, at whatever traditional vendor, that's just not going to cut it anymore, right? So that's another interesting trend.
I've long felt there's such an opportunity to pipe in expertise into the point of use, the point of use being the tool, the technology, the sourcing platform, whatever it may be. Because you have all the information and data available in that platform that can pipe out to an expert, and you pipe that knowledge back in. But now you're adding on LLMs and the knowledge graphs and everything you talked about, which actually questions, well, how much of the consultant time do we actually need to plug into that? As much of a check and a balance on the data than it is necessarily new insights that's coming in. So it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how that evolves. And I feel it's been slower than, I'm just surprised we haven't necessarily seen that yet in the market, but perhaps that's a market acceptance issue as much as it is a technology issue.
Yeah, and performance metrics, right? You get what you measure, right? And in tech sales and in services, you're always, if you can sell that elephant, and it's kind of what you measure. And right now, with I've worked for 3 consulting organizations. A lot of product development is done when consultants aren't out on billable projects, and that's just not a really great way to do product development. So they need to be serious about it. And so I absolutely recommend that people, when they're talking to their service providers, ask them how they are actually using Gen AI and LLMs or whatever as part of their offering, and how they're co-innovating with clients to kind of build this, et cetera. And if you start getting the scantily clad emperor doing the song and dance, then you should maybe think about looking elsewhere. So it does take time, but for folks who can do it well, I was just talking to a SaaS spend management kind of consultant that goes in there and they look at all your IT contracts, whatever, and they, here's how much we can save you. And a lot of it's kind of a contingency based sourcing. It's a lot of on the profit recovery, AP recovery, all that kind of, stuff, which is a great way to get started, right? In terms of if you have, the skeptical CFO, but, when you do this, you want to be able to kind of not just have them do it to you, but you'd like to kind of start building those muscles themselves, right? It's like a BPO that, you want them to transfer some of the capabilities to you. And that's kind of, and what they do is they built this tool where, we hoover in all your contracts, we analyze them, we use CLM kind of AI, identify all the opportunities, and then we serve it up to you. And by the way, here's your dashboard, with our insights kind of baked right in, and it kind of helps them because it takes all the knowledge of their own heads and puts it into a tool, and it just lets them now expand the market into a low touch offering. It's a, land and expand, or whatever you want to call it. So absolutely a major trend.
Yeah. No, I know that it's been a long time since we've had one of these conversations, so we could probably go on forever talking about a number of different strands, but we're coming up against time. So I wanted to just finish off by asking, and maybe this is a hard question, maybe it's not, for an analyst, in terms of getting out your crystal ball and thinking, 2025, we're at the end of 2025. What are a couple of things we're going to look back, do you believe, in 2025 from a Procure tech market that stood out?
I think what was nice about intake management as a way to focus procurement on stakeholders and stakeholder management and demand management was creating a singular focus, and it allows a good way to bring in functions to work on those common processes like in shared services or whatever the model, right? Not, operating models, right? And so I think that focus has been a great way to then bring in the whole orchestration, side of the equation. And obviously I know that's looking backwards. And I know people are sick of the term, even though not everybody even has a common understanding what the term actually means. That it really kind of kicked that off. So I think in 2025, I think there's going to be a hype that's happening around agentic AI and reasoning and kind of intelligent, bots and chatbots and agents and all of that, right? Kind of around this autonomous idea and all that. And I think that's going to be it's a lot, it's not a lot of hype, because ultimately the market will go that way, but it's going to be a lot like, when RPA, 10 or 15 years ago, right? And that is not necessarily an easy thing to get implemented. And the vendors will be like, don't worry, that's just how we, plug in and you use our system is through the bots and the agents. And we're going to, but, keep in mind they want you to be on their turf of building intelligence on their platform. So I think that there's going to be an equal amount of hype on the agentic AI side in 2025. I think looking back on the good side is going to be actually when orchestration gets real about not just within some of the, like the intake use cases, but starting to get into the enterprise use cases. And that's going to be a lot of now battles, around, service management and the service nows versus, all the enterprise players. Now is when it really gets real with all the functions working together to start doing this cross-functional orchestration. And there, unfortunately, I think you're going to run into the wall of change management and the issues, like just trying to get cross-functional alignment on SRM. And, in this case, let's say just take third-party risk management. Great, everybody's engaged. Well, great, everybody has their own agenda, and now we've got, 6 funding sources we got to pass around the tin cup, right? So the implementation issues, are going to just continue. The barriers will continue to be there now that we're dealing with these cross-functional areas. But to me, I think it's taking orchestration, also bringing that outside-in intelligence into these enterprise use cases, like TPRM or, ESG and things like that, I think is going to be an exciting period to watch.
Yeah, there's a lot more complexity in that enterprise space, isn't there, for sure? But I guess that brings greater rewards if you get it right.
Yeah, this is where procurement can leverage its also, its expertise around cost management and risk management and third-party management and supply network, kind of management and modeling. If you've done well and have done your homework and have built little competencies, now you have that ability to fill that white space or in commercial management instead of just traditional contracts and CLM and risk transfer. Hey, now we can actually start to have a better story. Right? So you could actually be in the driver's seat around doing these things because you've kind of maybe proven some of these things out in some of these initial use cases, et cetera. So, I think it's in the enterprise space that it's now the real leadership is going to be required, tech leadership, talent leadership. And so.
All right. Well, it's time to wrap up here. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. We'll have to make this more of a current occurrence. But for anybody who is listening in, I'd recommend go to spendmatters.com, check out Pierre Mitchell on LinkedIn. We'll put links to both of those on our website. You'll find that at procurement.com/podcast. So until the next time, Pierre, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you, Phil, and thanks for all you do. I am a consumer of your content, very much so, and I appreciate what you and Kelly are doing. It's really great stuff. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, Pierre. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.